Hi, Ian Roberts, mastering composition and simplifying the painting process. Only this week we're going to talk about the exact opposite. Someone who spent 8 years working on one painting, and then it was entombed twice, and 20 years later resurrected, considered one of the great works of art of the second half of the 20th century. And it's very possible you've never heard of it. So to give some context to that statement, Thomas Hoving, who was the director of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, spent a whole lifetime looking at art. And after he retired, he wrote a book about the very finest in Western art. And he thought it through, and he came up with 111 pieces, which he described overwhelmed at first sight. So there's pieces like the Venus of Willendorf and the Sphinx and Michelangelo's David, and many you'd expect and some you've never heard of. There was only 3 that were post-World War II, only 1 in the whole book done in the 60s, and the only one in the whole book done by a woman. And that was Jay DeFeo's The Rose. He described it. It could be intended as an illustration for the book of Genesis, a sort of angel of abstraction. One critic described it as like confronting a living, breathing thing. Jay DeFeo started it in San Francisco in 1958. In 1959, it was chosen for a seminal show in New York called 16 Americans at the Museum of Modern Art. Included Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns and Ellsworth Kelly. The curator wanted The Rose, and DeFeo said, "It's not finished, can't have it." Press loved it. There were buyers. No, can't sell it, it's not finished. In 1965, 8 years later, she was evicted from her San Francisco apartment. She'd only worked on this one painting. She'd restretched it. It had expanded. It was 11 feet tall, 8 feet wide, 8 inches thick, 2,300 pounds of solid paint. The director of the museum in Pasadena said she could store it there and finish it, but she had to return to San Francisco. The painting was shown briefly in Pasadena. There were no buyers. The world had moved on to pop art. The painting was returned to San Francisco. Jay DeFeo had no studio at the time, and the whole thing was cracking under its own weight. And now it gets weird. The San Francisco Art Institute, where she had friends, said she could store it there. And so it was encased in plaster and bolted to the wall to give it rigidity so it wouldn't keep cracking and breaking. And she never saw the painting again. For a decade, students drew on it, the way we used to draw on plaster casts when someone broke their leg when we were kids. It was covered in graffiti. And then the school needed space for a new lecture room, and they decided they'd just build a wall right down there, just set off in front of it, and they built a wall right in front of the Rose. And so now it was doubly entombed. And the weird part is, everybody in the art world knew it was there. The Rose was a legend in San Francisco, existing just behind that wall. And DeFeo, for 20 years, she made other work, she taught, but for 20 years, she tried to raise money for its restoration. And it wasn't until 1994, 7 years after DeFeo's death, the Whitney in New York raised $2,500 that was thought to be enough to restore it. And no one knew when they opened it whether it would just be slime and goo. The paint was still wet in the interior when it was encased in plastic. It was perhaps a ton of paint that had never dried. But on inspecting it, it turned out to be in good shape. It was restored in San Francisco with a steel frame embedded underneath, so it was over 3,000 pounds now. And the Rose became central to the show. The Whitney opened in 1995. 30 years to the day that the painting was removed from the apartment in San Francisco, the exhibit opened in New York. Personally, I was so fascinated by the story, I spent a year with the idea of turning it into a graphic novel using this story as inspiration. So I guess we could call this week's video one of the great works of art you've probably never heard of. So listen, I hope you have a great week. Please do subscribe, like this video if you like it, and I will see you next week. Have a great week. Bye for now.